Welcome to this extreme overclocking tutorial on the Z690 ASRock Aqua. In this video I will provide step-by-step guidance on how to overclock a Intel 12 Gen CPU on this mainboard. So let's start right away. Our initial setup is that our mainboard is already insulated and our LN2 port is mounted. In today's session I'm going to use the Reactor 3.0, which is developed by Burning OC. So let's get into the details of the BIOS. First of all, you want to make sure that there aren't any high voltages applied. To make sure that this isn't happening, I'm going to make a CMOS clear at the beginning. I already did this, and our situation is that we are in the BIOS at the moment. As you can see, we are in the easy mode BIOS and we are pressing F6 to enter our advanced BIOS. First of all, what I'm always gonna do is I'm loading a daily profile to just make sure that our mount is good. So I'm loading my daily profile and then I go straight into the OS. Now that we are in the OS, we are going to run a quick Cinebench and looking at the CPU temperatures with core temp. We make this to ensure that our mount is good and our port has good contact to our CPU. So as you can see, our temperatures of our individual cores is about nearly the same. They fluctuate about, let's say, 5 to 10 degrees, and that's totally fine. That's what we want to see. What we don't want to see is one core getting about like 20 degrees more than any other core. We want to see all cores about having the same temperatures. So this indicates a good mount at the beginning. And now that we know that everything is fine, we are going to pour down to minus 130 degrees. After we reached minus 130 degrees, we go straight into our BIOS and load the LN2 preset of the mainboard. The LN2 preset makes everything easy. It sets all relevant voltages and makes LN2 overclocking with this board child's play. So let's pour down. You might have wondered why my colors are a bit sucking. Well, my colors are off because I'm using a really old 1030. And I think the memory of my 1030 has a few problems. That's why I'm having problems with my colors. I really hope my 1030 survives today's session, but I'm not sure if it will. I really hope so. We have to get this video done, otherwise I get problems. No, I'm just kidding. We're having fun today. If this is actually your first time overclocking, you might consider running some Cinebench during the pull down to see if everything is still running fine. Just for your information, we are at minus 30 at the moment. And I'm opening CPU-C to show you the temperatures, which are already at 0 degrees. I'm approaching about minus 100 degrees at the moment. And what I'm gonna do now is just restarting and waiting in the BIOS. Actually, we are at minus 130 degrees, and what we're going to do now is we are loading our OC profile, which is the LN2 preset. The LN2 preset sets all relevant voltages. I'm going to show you. Our CPU configuration is all P cores set to 6 GHz, all efficiency cores set to 5 GHz, but at the moment we have the efficiency cores disabled and only going for the 8 P cores. So our cache ratio is at 5 GHz, which is also good, and those are the remaining settings, which are set by the LN2 mode. Our DRAM configuration is the Hynix preset, because we are using a Hynix DDR5 kit. What you can do is, if you have a Hynix DDR5 kit, is try the different profiles. Those are really good. My Hynix kit isn't the best, so I'm using the 6400 MHz type preset, but this is enough for the moment. So our voltage configuration is fairly easy. We are using 1.65 for starting with load line set at level 1, and all the remaining voltages, what you can see down below, besides the memory voltages, are already set by the L2 mode. Since I already know my CPU, which you don't if this is your first time overclocking, I know my CPU likes about 1.6 volts, so I'm going with 1.6 volts. This is the voltage my CPU likes, and you will probably have to find out what voltage your CPU likes. So at minus 130, everything is set and we can go into the OS. Now that we are in the OS, we are going to pull down till we reach full pot temperature, and if we reach full pot, we can start figuring out what overclocks our CPU can do. It might happen that if you reach full pot, your CPU will get a cold bug. Cold bug means that your system will freeze and you can't reboot at this temperature, but more on that later. As you can see, we are at full pot now and everything is working fine. The next step is to just reboot your system and not doing anything else. We are just rebooting. The reason why we are rebooting is because we want to retrain the memory. The IMC of the CPU gets weaker when the CPU reaches full pot temperature, and thus we have to retrain our memory. Now we are back into the OS, and what we're going to do now is just opening CPU-C, we are opening the ASRock overclocking tool, and we are opening Benchmade. So as you can see, memory is set, and we apply our 6.7 GHz CPU frequency, and it applied really fast. As you can see, 6.7 GHz is child's play with this board and CPU. Next step is to find out what CPU frequency your CPU can do. For that, what you actually want to do is you set 1.6 volts or 1.65, and then just look out if your CPU might do a higher frequency or if this already was the limit of the CPU. I already know that my CPU does 6.8 GHz, but this is because I already figured out before shooting this video. Let's try to see if the CPU can actually do a little bit more than 6.7 GHz. For that I am just going to raise the base clock, let's say to 100.1, which results in 6.85. Oh, about 6.85. And let's see if the CPU runs that. We are at the limit of my CPU now, and as you can see, my CPU runs 6.8, but no megahertz more. 6.8 is the limit, but that's fairly good, I'm fine with that, but your CPU might be able to go higher, or it might be not. What you actually want to do is, if you're hunting for a record, you also want to know the cache frequency of your CPU. To figure out what cache my CPU can do, I'm just going back with my base clock, because I already know my CPU won't do higher than the 6.8, and I'm just going to raise my cache frequency. So let's see if the CPU does 5.5 cache. For that, we also check in CPU-C if it was applied, and as you can see, it did not apply the cache frequency. So we have to restart and have to set the cache frequency in the BIOS. The problem that the cache frequency can only be applied in the BIOS will be fixed in newer iterations of the BIOS. What we are going to do now is we are going at our CPU configuration. Since we are at full pot and we know that our CPU runs 6.8 GHz, we can just set 6.8 GHz here in our BIOS, and we can go here to CPU cache ratio and set our CPU cache ratio directly in the BIOS. As you can see in CPU-C, our cache frequency was applied. Actually, if you want to overclock your cache, you have to set the cache in the BIOS and reboot about 1 or 2 times. Then the cache frequency will be applied. So if you want to hunt for a record obviously you want to set your priority to real time. This highest priority will always ensure the best score. So let's see which score we will get with 6.8 GHz on the P-cores, on all P-cores as you can see, and 5.7 GHz on our cache. Since we are using real time, we won't see an image rendered, we will just see the finalized score, or we will result in a blue screen. So as you can see, it didn't result in a blue screen, it resulted in a fairly good score, which is actually, I think it's about 10th place at the moment. What we can do is, we are using a little trick. We are just closing all the windows and we are pulling the Cinebench mirror out of the way. And we're going to rerun. Maybe this results in a higher score, maybe not. We will see. Actually, if you're hunting for records, you always want to rerun to see if you might get a higher score. Cinebench fluctuates quite a bit and rerunning is always the way to go. So as you can see, our score didn't get better, but this actually is fine because this is a fluctuation of Cinebench. One problem of the Intel 12th Gen CPUs is if they are resulting in a blue screen because you've set a too high overclock or your overclock wasn't stable, you will have a cold bug. Oh, that's a fairly good score. That's actually better than my high score at the moment. That's why I'm going to save the score. To save the score, what we need to do is we need to open 4 windows of CPU-C. The first window of CPU-C will be pulled down in the left corner, which just shows CPU settings. The next window will show the mainboard. The third window will show the memory. And the fourth window will show the SPD. You could take a screenshot right now, but what's actually safer is to save the result by pressing F6 now with Benchmade, because if you're using Benchmade, you can be sure that your result will always be a valid one. So as you can see, our Cinebench result of 10,892 points is saved and it's marked right here, and we could look it up or we could submit it to HWBot right away. If your CPU crashes, or let's say if your system crashes, what you want to do is you don't want to restart right away. You want to wait till there is a blue screen happening, and if there is a blue screen, you have to press the reset button. The problem is with those CPUs, they have a cold bug, and this cold bug means that you can't restart with the reset button if your CPU did crash completely. You really have to wait if there is a blue screen to fix this problem. It sounds a bit weird, but it's the only way to get around right now. As you can see, this is the highest score I could achieve with my CPU. It took me about, let's say, 30 minutes. This is because the board made it really easy and I already knew the limits of my CPU. What we are going to do now is we are going to take a short break, and after this short break I'm going to show you how to find the limits of your CPU with this amazing board. If you don't know what the limits of your CPU are, because you might have got a new CPU or this is your first time actually overclocking with this board. So let's take a short break. So let's start by finding out what your new CPU can do on this ASRock Aqua. Actually the LN2 mode sets about 1.65 volts. As we can see, I set 1.6 volts, and I recommend that you start by 1.6 volts because most of the Intel 12th Gen CPUs seem to like about 1.58 to 1.63 volts. So I think 1.6 volts is a really good starting point. As you can see, I've set the all-core ratio to 6.6 and I've set the cache ratio to 5.7. 5.7 might sound a bit high, so let's start by 5.5. This should run on most CPUs, but first of all we are going to focus on our all-core ratio, and after that we are going to find out what our cache can do. So now that we are in the OS, we are going to launch Benchmade, we are going to launch CPU-C, and we are going to use the ASRock tuning tool to set the voltages and to set our multipliers. If you want to find out what your CPU can do, I actually recommend to set the priority of Cinebench to normal. If you set it to normal, you see how far the image will render, and if you see that the image crashes at the very first seconds or at the very end, it will indicate how stable your overclock was. So it's actually good to see how far the image was rendered. First thing we're going to do is check if our 6.6 GHz we set on all P cores are running fine. If we verified that our 6.6 GHz are running fine, we can check for 6.7 GHz. So let's see if 6.6 GHz will run. As you can see, the 6.6 GHz is running pretty fine, and it looks like we won't have any troubles. After it finishes the run, I'm just going straight to try 6.7 GHz, because most 12900Ks are able to do 6.7 GHz. So let's see if this CPU can do 6.7 GHz. As you can see, the 6.7 GHz are now applied, and we're just rerunning Cinebench. And as you might have noticed already, this mainboard makes it really easy to overclock a 12th gen CPU. The only thing we need is our tool to set the multiplier in the OS and some liquid nitrogen and a liquid nitrogen pot. Maybe a 12900K would be good, but any other 12th gen CPU is of course fine. So as you saw, 6.7 GHz seems fine. Actually, we won't hunt for 6.8 GHz right away, because most CPUs won't go higher than about 6.75. So we are going to see in really small steps if 6.7 plus is possible. To do this, we are going to raise our BCLK to say let's 100.50, which will result in, as you can see here in CPU-C, 6.730 MHz. You have to keep in mind, if you raise the BCLK frequency, it will also raise your memory frequency. So you have to make sure that your memory OC isn't already at its limits, because if it's at its limits, it will crash if you raise the BCLK. So let's see if that runs. And it looks like it's running, because the image is fairly far rendered and it's not stuttering, it's smooth. And our score did also improve quite a lot. So let's see if the CPU is capable of more. The next step I'm going to take is 101 BCLK. This is a huge step, but at the beginning you can make huge steps, and at the end you have to take smaller steps. You see, our frequency is now at 67.67. So let's see if the CPU can do this. Okay, it looks like our CPU won't be able to do this because we got an error right at the beginning. But this error isn't a bad one, it might just be a corrupted OS or problems with Cinebench. That's why I'm just going to restart Cinebench and let's see if it runs. If it runs not, we know that the CPU can't do this frequency at this voltage. But as you can see, it runs fine, and it probably was some problem with Cinebench or anything else. We don't know at the moment. But the CPU seems to have no problems at this frequency. Okay, so let's see if our CPU is able to clock even higher. Next step would be a small step. We are going to 101.30 and see if this will run. We are really near to 6.8 GHz now, so now it's getting really exciting. But it looks like it will work out. And as you already saw, we didn't need to raise the voltage or we didn't need to lower the voltage at the moment. If we run into a wall, which the CPU won't clock any higher, we might adjust our voltage up or down. So let's see if we can go even higher. And I'm going to take another small step. I'm just going to 101.50, which is about 6.8. So let's see if those 6.8 GHz are possible or not. Okay, it looks like this error is happening after a few reruns of Cinebench, which might be a problem with my installation. Or it was actually because the frequency isn't stable. But since it's running, it looks like it's a problem with my Cinebench installation. Okay, 6.8 GHz seems stable, so we are going for a higher frequency now. What you can do is you could go down to base clock 100 and set P-core ratio multiplier to 6.8, since we already know that 6.8 GHz are working. So let's do that. Just go to 6.8 and this is set back to 100. It will result in the same frequency, but we don't have to raise the BCLK any higher. High BCLK can also result in a few problems, so it's also recommended to not go too high with your BCLK. As you can see, this results in the same 6.8 GHz, which we already knew will run. So let's see if we can go higher, though I'm going to take a small step, like 0.1 multiplier, which result in 6.8. And it looks like it will run. No, it didn't finish the benchmark. So what we are going to do now is we are waiting for our blue screen, and after it finished the first 21%, we are going to press restart because our system is then restarting. If your system is not restarting, which mine doesn't, we have to heat up to about minus 130 degrees and then go cold again. But actually that's how to overclock your 12th gen Intel CPU on the ASRock Aqua and how to find out what your CPU can do. So what I do is I'm going to heat up step by step and continuously press restart, and if your CPU hits a temperature which it likes, it will restart. Then if we restart it and we are back in the OS, we will actually continue our process to find out what maximum CPU frequency our P-cores can do. We are going to heat up and I'm going to activate the E-cores to overclock the CPU as 16-core CPU. So let's heat up and after a short break we will be back again.